Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. My name is Brittany of BrittanyJJones.com. If this is your first time tuning into my channel, welcome. I hope that you will like what you see and subscribe below for more. In today's video, we are going to be sewing and we're going to be following along with Mccalls 7960. I'm going to be following along with view B on this pattern. That's the view I decided to make. If you have any questions about the fabric that I use, the notions that I purchased, if you want to take a closer look at the sewing instructions, or maybe you want to know the size that I cut for this skirt, you can check all those details out in this preview video that I did for this pattern. I went over all of that for you there. Before we get started, I do want to mention one thing with the waistband. If you are going to be attaching a tie to yours, I left the tie off of my waistband. So if you are going to attach a tie, then definitely follow along with the steps for 23 and 24. I have my instructions right here. That's why I'm looking down. So definitely follow along with those steps, even though it says for view A and B. If you have the tie, then follow along with those steps. If you are not using the tie like I did in for view B, then follow along with 26 and 27. When I attached the tie following along with 23 and 24, even though it says for views A and B, I did not like the way it looked at all. I was like, what is this? This is not it. So I ended up following along with steps 26 and 27 to finish off my self-facing and my waistband. So I just wanted to mention that. But of course, you know, in the video, I went through all those steps. I showed you all what it looks like and how I fixed it, but I just wanted to give you a heads up before we started sewing. Last thing, if anyone has any questions about what I am wearing, this is Mccalls 7970. I went with view B to make this dress, and this look is already on the blog. So that is it. Go ahead and cut out your pattern, cut out your fabric, transfer all your markings, and let's get started. To begin sewing our skirt, the first thing that we're going to do is take 2 of our pockets. You should have cut out 4 for this pattern. I have 2 right here. We're going to pin 1 to each side of our front piece. So the front is piece number 2 and the pocket is piece number 1. Before I pin mine though, I want to go ahead and finish off the raw edges of my pocket. So I'm going to take it to my serger and I'm just going to finish off the edges now. And when I finish them off with the serger, I'm not trimming away any fabric. I'm just serging right along the edge. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that now. All right, so now that I have the edges of the pocket finished with the serger, I'm gonna go ahead and pin it onto the skirt. On the side of the skirt, right side's facing, matching up the notch. So you should have transferred a notch right here for your pocket. I'm gonna go ahead and match up the notch and pin in place. Gonna do the other one the same way. Now I'm gonna take it to the machine and I'm going to stitch the pocket down at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Alright, so I just sewed on the pockets to the front of the skirt at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then I finished off those edges with my serger here. You can see after I stitched it, I used my serger to finish off the raw edge, and then I pressed the pocket toward that seam. So the next step is to put our front pieces to the side and go ahead and grab our back piece. You should have cut out 1 on the fold of your fabric, and we're going to do the same exact thing that we did to the front. We're going to take our other 2 pocket pieces and we're going to pin them right sides facing to the side and stitch it at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You can see here that I finished off my edges of the pocket the same way that I did for the front pockets. So I'm just going to find my notch here and pin in place. Okay, now I can go to the sewing machine and go ahead and stitch it at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And after I have it stitched, I'm going to go ahead and finish off the raw edges with my serger. Alright, so I have the back pockets sewn on, the side edges are finished, as well as I pressed the pocket out toward the seam. So now we can go ahead and grab our front pieces and lay them right sides facing to the back. And now we're going to go ahead and pin the side seam in place. I'm going to put a pin up here at the top to match up that seam. I'm going to match up my notches here and pin in place. I'm also going to pin my pocket together. Alright, so when we go to the sewing machine to stitch our side seams together, we're going to begin stitching up here at the top. Make sure that you back stitch at the beginning of the stitch, and we're going to stitch down to the first large circle, back stitch there, and then we're going to leave this open for our pocket. We're going to begin stitching here. Make sure that you back stitch and then stitch all the way to the hem of the skirt and back stitch here as well. And then we're going to stitch around our pocket to close up our pocket. We're going to do that for both side seams of the skirt. So let's go ahead and do all the stitching now. Alright, so I just sewed my front and back together at the side seams as well as around the pocket. Next, I'm going to clip right here along the back seam allowance only. Right up under the pocket, I'm just going to clip diagonally here. So now I can go to the ironing board and press this seam open. I'm going to do the same thing for the other pocket. And again, it's the back seam allowance only, not the front. Just gonna clip right into the seam allowance. You should not be clipping into your skirt, just the seam allowance. And now I'm going to press this seam open. So let's go ahead and go to the ironing board now and press our seams. Alright, so I have pressed my seams open, and now we can move on to the next step. The next step is to go ahead and finish off this self-facing edge right here, and you can finish it off a couple of ways. You can finish it off using some picking shears. You can also use a zigzag stitch and just stitch really close to the edge. You can fold in 1/4 inch and finish it off that way. You can use a serger, or you could also use some bias tape. So you have a couple different options on how you want to finish off this self-facing edge. I'm just going to use my serger and just serge this raw edge, and then once we have this finished, we can fold it in along the fold line. So I'm going to go to my serger now to just finish off this raw edge. So I just finished off the edge of the self-facing, so now I'm going to fold it in along the fold line, and I put 2 snips up here as well as one down here at the bottom where my fold line is. So I'm going to fold along that, take it to my ironing board, and give this a good press. So I just pressed in my self-facing along the fold line. Here it is here. So the next step is to go ahead and create gathers along the upper edge of our skirt. So you should have transferred a circle right here. It's right along at the upper edge of the fold line. You should have transferred a circle on both ends. So we're going to begin gathering here, but I'm going to gather section by section. So I'm going to do 2 rows of gathering stitches here for the front, 2 rows of gathering stitches for the back, and then 2 rows of gathering stitches right here for the front, making sure that we stop at the circle that we transferred. And the gathering stitches will be done at a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and then the second one at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, making sure that you are using a basting stitch so that we'll be able to gather up the upper edge of our skirt. So let's go ahead and do all of our gathering stitches now. Alright, so I just put the gathering stitches along the upper edge of the skirt. So now we can go ahead and put this to the side and start working on our waistband. So here is my waistband piece, and I have already fused interfacing to it. So you go ahead and fuse interfacing to your waistband piece, as well as fold up 5/8 inch on the unnotched long edge. And once you have the 5/8 inch pressed up, we're going to trim it down to 3/8 inch. So I have my ruler, and I'm going to measure out 1/4 inch and trim off 1/4 inch. Alright, so I just trimmed it down. So now this is 3/8 inch that's pressed up. So now we're going to fold the waistband along the fold line, and I put clips on the side of mine so I know where my fold line is. So I'm just going to fold it in half. Do the same thing to the other side. Fold along the fold line, pin in place. And now we can stitch both ends at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. All right, now that we have the sides of the waistband stitched, I'm going to go ahead and trim my seam. Now I'm going to turn it right side out. I'm going to take it to the ironing board and give it a good press. Okay, so I just gave my waistband a really good press. So now we can go ahead and grab our skirt, and we can pin the waistband to the skirt. You want to put the squares at the side seams and match up your notches, and then we're going to pull up the gathers to fit it to the waistband. So I'm going to find my markings. We also want to make sure that we're keeping this pressed edge of the waistband out of the way. So I'm just going to pin here. Here's my square, so I'm going to pin there. And I'm going to start here on this section first and just gather up the gathers. Okay, so I'm just going to continue to gather up the skirt and pin it to the waistband. Okay, so I just finished gathering up my skirt, so now it is all pinned to the waistband. I've also pinned my pockets going toward the front. Both of my pockets are pinned in place. So now before I go to the machine, I'm going to fold my self-facing to the outside onto itself. So here's the self-facing. I'm going to fold it onto itself like this, and I'm going to pin in place. Making sure the raw edges are even. I'm going to do the same thing to the other side. I'm going to fold over the self-facing right along that fold line. I'm going to pin in place. Now I'm going to take it to the machine, and I'm going to baste this in place first. And after I baste it and check it and make sure that I like the way my gathers are looking and that everything is stitched correctly, then I'm going to stitch in a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, being sure not to catch this folded edge of the waistband. Okay, so I just stitched on my waistband to my skirt, and I just took a look at it, and I do not like this. This part right here with the self-facing, the way it turns in, and you can see here that the seam allowance is facing down. So I want to play around with this a little bit because I just don't like this. So doing it the way I just did it, with folding the self-facing to the outside like this and then turning it to the inside, I mean, all that looks clean, but I would rather this seam allowance be up here toward the waistband, all of it. So I'm going to take this stitch out right quick and see what I can do to make this look a little bit better. Okay, so I have unpicked the self-facing portion, and I've decided I'm just going to fold this back to the inside, stitch it with the seam allowance, and then once that's stitched, I can just bring this waistband over it and slip stitch it closed. Alright, so I just fixed these self-facings, and I like them so much better now. And I looked down in the pattern at step 26 and 27, and this is how they finished it for views C and D, but since I'm doing view B, I'll follow along with view B, but I think that will work better for the views with the ties. So if you are doing the views without the tie, then I pretty much just follow the steps for view C and D by keeping the self-facing folded to the inside and stitching it in that stitch instead of folding it along the outside around the waistband. So I just wanted to point that out. All right, so now that we have that, I'm gonna go ahead and trim down my seam. So I just trimmed down the seam. Now I'm going to fold over the waistband and I'm gonna pin it in place. And you want to make sure that this folded edge is going just a little bit past your stitches. You don't want to be able to see your stitch. All right, so I have my waistband pinned. The next step is to grab a needle and thread, and you want to go ahead and slip stitch this close. You can also stitch in the ditch if you would like to, but if you want to stitch in the ditch, make sure that you place your pins on the outside so while you're stitching you can remove them, and you just want to stitch right in this seam, making sure that you catch a little bit of this waistband in your stitch. That's an option if you don't want to slip stitch. I'm gonna go ahead and do my slip stitch and I'll be back to show you what that looks like. All right, so I have my waistband all slip stitched down in place. So the next step is to go ahead and do a row of edge stitching right here along the lower edge of the band. I am going to omit that step just because I like this look that I have here. I don't want to add a row of stitching, but if you want to add a row of edge stitching, that is the next step, and you can go ahead and stitch close to this lower edge all the way along the waistband. So you can go ahead and do that now, and then we can move on to the next step. The next step is to go ahead and begin working on our hem. So this self-facing portion that we folded in along the fold line and gave it a good press, we're just going to fold that to the outside onto itself. And I know my self-facing is not, it looks a little bit different, it's a little smaller down here. That's because I did not have as much fabric as I thought I had, so I had to just kind of make it work. So yours should be the full 2 inches for the self-facing all the way down here. But to finish off the hem, we're just going to turn the self-facing to the outside onto itself, and we're going to put a pin there in place. I'm going to do it for the other side as well. Just fold the self-facing onto itself and pin in place. Now we're going to go to the machine and we're going to stitch across this at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now I am going to use a regular machine stitch and stitch right across here at a 5/8 of an inch. But then once I get past the facing, I'm going to change to a basting stitch, and I'm going to continue stitching on the 5/8 of an inch seam line all the way along my skirt. And I'm going to do that because that's going to give me a guide for my hem. So once I have the basting stitch at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, then I can just go to my ironing board and press that up using that basting stitch as a guide. And then we can fold in a 1/4 of an inch of the raw edge to create a narrow hem. So I'm going to go ahead to the machine now and do that stitch. I am going to trim off these corners right here. So I trimmed off the facing and angled it right here at the corner. I might trim off just a little bit more of that. I'm going to trim the other side the same way. Okay, now we can flip this to the right side and go ahead and press up our hem. Okay, so I just pressed my hem in place, and like I said, I was just going to use that basting stitch as a guide. So that's what I did. I pressed up right on that 5/8 of an inch seam line, and then I folded in a 1/4 of an inch along that raw edge. So now I can go to the machine. I'm going to stitch close to this inner fold to stitch our narrow hem in place. Alright, so I just finished up my hem. I have it all sewn in place, and I removed that basting stitch and gave it another good press. So now we can move on to sewing on our hook and eyes. Ooh, let me cut this thread there. So you should have transferred 2 small markings on your waistband. If your small circles have disappeared since we've been constructing our skirt, go ahead and get your pattern piece back out and transfer those small circles, because that is the placement for our waistband hook and eyes. So I have a pack of 4 right here that I picked up from my local Joann's. And these are the waistband hook and bars. These are for pants, waistbands, as well as skirts. So I'm just going to get 2 sets of these. Also, go ahead and grab you a needle and thread. And this is the inside of my skirt. This is the right side that's going to wrap over the left. So right here, I'm going to grab the hooks. I'm going to line the top of it up with the small circle. And I'm going to start right here on this outer one. I'm going to make sure that I don't go through so that you can see the stitches on the outside. I'm just going to stay right here on the inside. I'm just going to start looping it around. I'm going to do maybe 3 or 4 times. So I did 3 or 4 loops right here on this side. So now I'm going to go up here to the top. And to do that, I want to tunnel it under the fabric. So I'm just going to slide this over so you can see. I just want to tunnel this right under the fabric. I tunneled it over so you don't see me jumping from loop to loop. So now I'm going to go ahead and start up here and do about 2 or 3 loops. Again, you want to make sure that you're not going through the other side of the fabric. And keep it as straight as possible while you're sewing it on. Okay, now I'm going to tunnel it under so that it goes to this other side. And now I'm just going to continue looping again like 2 or 3 times in each hole to secure the hook, and make sure that you keep it straight while you're doing it. So here's my first hook. I'm going to go ahead and stitch the other one on the same way. Alright, so now that I have the 2 hooks sewn on, I went ahead and I wrapped my skirt around me, and I transferred markings where I would need for these bars to go. So I have the 2 markings here. The last step for me to do is to just sew the bars on. I'm going to sew them on the same exact way that I did for the hooks, and then I'll be all done with my skirt. Thank you all so much for joining me for another sew along. I really do hope that you all enjoyed it. If you have any questions, please leave them down for me below. I'll be more than happy to answer. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you all in the next video. Blessings, everyone. Bye.